Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. We are going to be discussing a topic that is both timely and pertinent to the field of Title IX, victim advocacy, and inclusion, and also timely because July is Disability Pride and Awareness Month. I'm Dr. Laura McGuire with the National Center for Equity and Agency, and our webinar today is sponsored by EEO Now. We are going to be discussing neurodiversity in Title IX with two expert panelists who will share their experience in how their work, professional and personal life intersect with this topic. Christy, could you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a bit about your work and how it intersects with Title IX and neurodiversity?
I'm happy to. Thank you for having me, Dr. McGuire. I'm pleased to participate today because the subject is so important and because I work at MTSU, that's Middle Tennessee State University, in the Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance. So we not only handle Title IX, but also disability issues. And, you know, there's a lot of intersection there. We also are responsible for concerns about race, national origin, other protected categories. And so I started as a Title IX investigator and I'm now in charge of the office. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do more good in more capacities. But I also have a child who is on the spectrum. So I have a personal perspective on this as well. But it keeps me grounded. It keeps me where it's not just dealing with other people in a way that I have to try to understand. I have more of an innate understanding of the circumstances that surround people on the spectrum.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to hear more about that. Alyssa-Rae, can you tell us a bit about your work and how it intersects with these two topics?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me on this panel today. I'm really excited to be here with both of you. My name is Alyssa-Rae McGinn. I work as an independent investigator and consultant on Title IX matters and other matters related to civil rights and equity issues, mainly at schools, but also at companies, nonprofit organizations, sort of anywhere where issues of identity-based bias, discrimination, and violence can pop up, which is unfortunately everywhere. This company is called Schorr LLC, and we work all across the country, but I personally am based in Boston today. Doing the work that I do, I get to see a really wide swath of how various organizations handle Title IX matters and all the different unique situations that can come up. And you know, every school has a slightly different approach, even under these new regulations that so prescribe the process. Every school has a different approach, and every school has a different level of understanding and accessibility for folks with disabilities of any kind, but especially for their neurodiverse population. So I think this is a really great conversation to be having. It's a conversation that needs to be had at every school, at every organization. And I'm looking forward to really being able to discuss how each student and each person who comes through a Title IX process, their unique needs are so important to ascertain, to understand, and to be welcoming and affirming of, not just sort of be tolerant of, or perhaps not understand or act like it's not something that needs kind of a different touch within a Title IX investigation or process.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that. I know a lot of people watching this today are familiar with my work, but if anyone's not, my background is starting the first sexual misconduct prevention and response program at the University of Houston. Had a lot to do with restorative practices and developing that program as well. And in that work, neurodiversity kept coming up over and over again, both in the resources that were out there that were not accessible for survivors, and as well as the way that respondents were framed, particularly ones who were not predatory in any way, but were still being kind of put in that box because they were struggling with social cues. I'm also the mother of a child on the spectrum as well. And when you blend those two things, just as Christy mentioned, your personal life, your family, with what you're seeing in the world, that passion just really ignites and becomes part of your advocacy and action. So I would love to hear from both of you. For anyone who's listening to this and is like, okay, these terms, Title IX, neurodiversity, neurodivergence, like I've heard them, but if someone quizzed me, I couldn't define them. So Alyssa-Rae, could you start and give us a definition of both what Title IX is and what is neurodiversity?
Title IX is a federal law. So it's actually a very short federal law that pretty much just says that educational institutions cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And this has been expanded. It started, I think a lot of people know of Title IX in terms of gender equity in sports. But over about the past 15, 20 years, it's been really developed to also cover elements of sexual harassment and sexual violence and gender-based harassment and violence. And actually, very recently, it was expanded explicitly to cover LGBTQ folks who are experiencing harassment and discrimination as well. So it's become extremely expansive over the years. And it really is the primary mechanism through which most schools adjudicate and deal with, whether that includes punishment or some other kind of way to address potential issues of sexual harassment and sexual violence on campus. Neurodiversity, I think that it has a different meaning to so many people. I tend to understand it as all the different ways that we can go through the world, process the world, interact with the world differently, all the kind of different natural differences that can occur in our brains, in our neurology, and in how you might feel and think internally and be perceived by the world externally. And I know that it is largely applied to autism spectrum disorder, but I also have certainly seen it especially in the Title IX realm in terms of other forms of kind of different thinking about the world, like ADD and ADHD, anxiety disorders, trauma response disorders, all of these things come into the Title IX process in intersecting ways.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And yes, Title IX is actually very short, and people would think it was like a book in itself, but it's brief and it's very succinct, and then has kind of organically evolved into these other areas. Interestingly, if you look at the case law, disability intersects with Title IX going back to the 1980s. Really early in its inception, because of the way that gender perceptions and gender norms were being placed on students with disabilities. Christy, can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on Title IX and how you would define it, and neurodiversity as well?
Yeah, I think Alyssa-Rae did a great job explaining those things. Title IX in itself, the law is very short. It's basically a paragraph. However, the implementing regulations are thousands of pages long. And so it's not something that you can just kind of pick up and go with. You really have to have extensive study to be able to understand how it works, how it applies, where the limits are. And the way that it gets implemented is that, there's the federal law, everybody has to do it. Like that's the kind of canopy that we work under. But each school uses its own policies to implement that law. So we have the law and the regulations that the federal government says apply, but then each institution creates its own policies that give specific definitions that apply in their own setting and their own process. So while there's an overarching, like these elements at least must be present, each institution has a little bit of wiggle room in how things actually get done. So it's very different from one place to another, you know, as far as the specifics of the process. But yeah, that what I tell people about Title IX in general is it's there to make sure that people aren't treated in a negative way because of sex, gender, you know, sexual orientation, gender identity, all those things. So as far as neurodiversity goes, I love the way that Alyssa-Rae put that about it's how you know, project yourself and how others perceive you. And I know that sometimes people use neurodivergence kind of interchangeably with neurodiversity. And I think that that's done enough to where they're basically considered the same. I personally tend not to use neurodivergent as a descriptor because to me, it sounds like it has a bit of a negative connotation because you're diverging from some norm. Whereas neurodiversity just kind of encapsulates all of the many ways that people, you know, people's minds work, and neurology is very complex. So I tend to use the word neurodiverse more than neurodivergent.
Awesome, thank you so much. You know, talking about our work and the places that we've seen this, you know, again, I saw so many situations, particularly with stalking and harassment, where the Title IX office would be called and, you know, they would have some kind of finding around that. And as soon as I would be assigned to do some kind of intervention with the respondent in a restorative practice, I would notice, well, you know, this is an issue here, and has that been included in the conversation that was had at any point? On the other hand, I was also going out and training people in how to report, and they were saying things like, you know, I tried calling, but I had a really hard time understanding the person on the other line because of my sensory processing, and they hung up on me. And, you know, and again, these issues just were not really being discussed at that time, and it wasn't that long ago. And I know, Christy, when we met at a conference where I was talking about overcoming obstacles and pushback to having tough conversations around Title IX in schools. And I think I mentioned that I had a son on the spectrum, and you were like, yes, me too, let's connect, let's collaborate. And so I'd love to hear any examples that you have in, again, how this issue has come up in the field, how you see this as being applicable to your work, and where maybe schools are missing the mark by not having this even on their radar. So Christy, can you start with your thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah, very early on in my career here at MTSU, I had a case with an individual who presented differently than a lot of our students do. And while I didn't know whether, you know, this person had a diagnosis or not, the cues that I was seeing made me think maybe they were on the spectrum or had some other, you know, neurodiversity at play. And, you know, having the background that I had, not only, you know, having a child who's on the spectrum, my previous work was in juvenile court. I practiced as an attorney in juvenile court for 10 years and represented mostly children in foster care. And so I had learned a lot about different ways that people, you know, share information, especially when they've been through trauma or have some sort of diagnosis. And, you know, I was really grateful in that moment to be able to recognize that the cues that I was seeing didn't mean that this individual had done anything wrong necessarily. They just communicated in a different way. And I tell people I have the patience of a stone. And I think that that's one of the things that's like really important in dealing with especially people on the spectrum, because they may have, you know, stimming that they need to do in order to comfort themselves through a difficult process, like talking to a stranger about some horrible thing that's happened to them. And so if they need to get up and walk around, or if they are, you know, touching things or looking at the lights or anything along those lines, I recognize that as a way that they are, you know, dealing with their own needs, as opposed to ignoring me or trying to avoid answering questions and things like that. And it's really difficult, you know, to approach everyone with kind of a blanket, like, way of explaining the process. And so what I try to do with people is say, you know, I recognize that this is really stressful. If you need, you know, I have fidgets that I keep available. And so I'll say, if you need to, you know, work with one of these, that's fine. If there's something else that would make you comfortable, please understand, I'm not going to judge. But we need to get through this process. And, you know, communication is sometimes very difficult for people on the spectrum, but engaging in that and getting through it is absolutely necessary in order to be able to, you know, have justice. And so I've had other individuals since then that I think, you know, I've been able to implement some of those things with, and it's been helpful. But that was the first one where I really felt like, okay, I'm here and can do some good. And I don't know who else would have handled this, but I was comfortable being able to get that person through that process in a way that they needed.
And on that note, for schools that, you know, again, are like, listen, we're exhausted, we're tapped, you're adding another thing. That's always something I hear in multiple frames of trying to increase inclusion in advocacy, is another thing. How would you speak to that, Christy, for other professionals who might be, you know, hesitant, or have a department that's hesitant to add this onto what they're doing and how they're approaching these conversations?
What, I'm sorry, what do you mean by adding it in? Like having a Title IX professional?
No, as in having that lens that you just talked about, right? Where they think, I already have enough things on my mind. I now have to have fidget spinners. I now have to think about explaining things in different ways. Again, for us on this panel and for many people watching, it's yes, because it's the right thing to do. But there are other people who are going to either push back against them bringing that up, or say, oh, we don't have that many students with those concerns, so this is not something we should invest our time and energy in.
Well, there are a couple thoughts. The first is the liability of you doing it wrong is not worth not doing it right. You know, I know schools get that, like, you know, liability is a big issue, and you know, it's a part of risk management. But the more human and I think recognizable aspect of that is, it's like if you've had a really bad day, you've got a flat tire on the way to work, you've got a headache, you know, you've got somebody in your family who's going to have medical testing, there could be something really wrong, you've got all these things weighing on you, and then somebody comes in and says, hey, I need to talk to you about this thing, and they start like firing off questions, and you're like, what, just give me a second. You know, like sometimes you need a little bit of extra processing time, and that's how it is for individuals on the spectrum all the time. So I think being able to, you know, whether that's just not how you typically roll, or, you know, there are so many other demands, and you're, you know, you feel like you need to get to those too, and so you feel rushed. I think being able to kind of have that personal relation, you know, like, okay, what if this was me? Or, you know, someone who you could relate that to is helpful to just be able to say, look, it is the right thing to do. There's the liability, but, you know, I recognize that sometimes I might need an extra, you know, slower pace. Let me see if I can do this. And if you need to break things up into, you know, smaller conversations and take a break and then resume, that's a perfectly reasonable approach most of the time.
Thank you so much for addressing that. I think that's so important. Alyssa-Rae, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of these things as well.
Honestly, I love the way that you put that, Christy. I think, it really needs to be more of a change in your mindset more than kind of an additional thing. It's not sort of another check the box to just have things on your desk, or, offer that, add that as a statement in your script. It's really a mindset about meeting everyone where they are. And I think that that's a really important aspect of ensuring accessibility, is that we're understanding that every single person coming in the room is carrying with them all these different ways that they have experienced what they're coming in to report, or what they're coming in to talk about, have experienced, the whole process up to this point, and just might be experiencing and processing what's happening in their daily life and what's happening that day. Um, and I think that, it shouldn't be on a student, or an employee, or someone who's in a Title IX process, to have to out themselves as autistic, or have to out themselves as neurodiverse in any way either. I think that's something I see, is a lot of schools will sort of only kick into this accessibility mode when someone actually identifies themselves as neurodiverse. And that shouldn't be the approach. It should be just, your mindset is, you go in and say, everyone needs something different from me. Everyone has unique needs. And, there are certain things I should keep an eye to try to understand with empathy, where is this person? Do they need me to talk slower? Do they need this in writing? Do they need to get up and walk around the room a little bit? Do they need to have someone with them who I normally might not let someone who is in this position have with them? And it's thinking about those aspects to make someone comfortable in a process that is inherently so uncomfortable. And this is really the case on all sides too. I think that a lot of schools think about how autism intersects with Title IX in terms of kind of the respondent who, is engaged in some kind of stalking or harassment allegations. And it's partly because perhaps they're not understanding those social cues. But I think it's also really important to recognize that anyone who comes in to report, or any witness, may also be neurodiverse and may present in a way that you don't expect. And I think that's also where it's really important for Title IX professionals, especially, to really understand the nuances of kind of debunking those myths, that there's no one way to be a survivor of sexual violence, and there's no one way to respond to the stress of being accused either. Everyone is going to come with their sort of different ways of being. I've had complainants who are completely stoic. I've had complainants who break down crying. I've had complainants who try to explain to me that they didn't pick up on the red flags that maybe someone else would, and they try to explain that it's because they're weird, or because they, don't pick up on things other people pick up on. And I'm not asking them to out themselves as neurodiverse if they are, but I'm understanding that what they're telling me is they may be processing those interactions differently from somebody else. And I think it's just always keeping your ears open and approaching everyone, meeting them where they are.
Thank you. Thank you so much for touching on all of that. It's funny because I use this example in the trauma-informed certifications that we have. And I always say, like, trauma-informed care shouldn't be something you leave on a shelf until someone comes in and discloses they're a survivor. And then you're like, oh, a survivor. Well, here's my lovely trauma-informed care. Let me take it out for you, right? That's not how we should operate. It's something we should use every time we're approaching anyone. And a huge aspect of that is accessibility, and understanding how disability intersects with trauma and any kind of experience, whether they're reporting or they're being accused of something. And like you both have mentioned, just bringing that into any conversation, not saying, well, I need documentation of this before I have that approach. Sadly, I've recently been working on a case not related to Title IX, but still related to student rights at a university. And it was very much a situation where the school loves to say, we're so inclusive, we're always out there, making sure everybody gets what they need. But then we're ready to expel someone because they didn't have documentation of a disability until they had that. And then also legal representation on top of it. Were they even willing to hear what they had to say instead of you know, have all of these kind of negative consequences for things that were truly out of their control. So I'm so glad to hear, you know, all of these voices saying we're doing it, it's possible, it's important. It also has to do with liability. If we can't connect to your heart, like at least we can connect to that, and to try to get more of these conversations in more institutions. So we are approximately at time for our conversation today. So I'd love to hear any closing thoughts you have, as well as how folks can get connected to you in the future.
I can go first. I think just in closing, you know, I think that it's really important for schools to recognize the importance of continuing this conversation. This is not a conversation that's happening very often. And in the lead up to this panel, folks that I spoke with about this panel coming up, you know, kind of expressed to me, wow, that's, you know, that's great that that's even a topic that's being talked about, because we're just not having that conversation. So I think that this is a great first step, and I hope that everyone who's here and anyone who's watching the recording later on, you know, continues this conversation, looks out for resources. You know, there's some great people on social media you can follow. There's great articles out there about how sexual violence and neurodiversity intersect. So, you know, keep learning on your own, continue that education. If anybody would like to get in touch with me, you can find out more information on danshorllc.com. You can also email me. My email address is just my first name, Alyssa-Rae, without the hyphen. So ALYSSARAE at danshorllc.com.
Yeah, so I think like the one thing that I would really like to get across to as many people as possible is the value of individuals on the spectrum having like a support team, whether it's friends, family, a counselor, people that that person can go to who knows like their constellation of symptoms, you know, how they present, and how best to interact with them, so that when there is something tough that comes up, then they've got people they can go to and say, like, this person said this thing or did this thing, like, is that okay? You know, just people to bounce things off of and keep them supported when they're going through, you know, potential offenses like this. I think too, you know, for older individuals who may be in college or about to enter college, the idea of connecting with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, might be really useful for them. They might also look into, like, our institution has started doing group counseling sessions online, which kind of generated from the shutdown last year. But those are ways that they might also connect and be able to have some supports. And that's just so critical. I mean, for anyone, you know, humanity, we are naturally like driven to connect with other people, but having a kind of exclusive set of folks that you can go to, who you trust, who you see on a regular basis, I think is really important. And then, you know, trying to make sure that when there are, you know, for institutional issues, when you're looking at policies and procedures, keeping in mind kind of like universal design. You know, we look at that a lot of times for like physical access to things. It needs to be about all kinds of access. And so keeping in mind neurodiversity in those, you know, policy and procedure changes is really critical as well. And it's not just for students. You know, we have faculty and staff here who identify, you know, as neurodiverse, and you never know when you're going to encounter someone who has those needs. So I think it is just kind of that giving people basic dignity and meeting them where they're at is just invaluable. And So that's what I always encourage my team, and hopefully that message is spreading. For people who want to connect with me, the easiest thing is my email address, which is christy.sigler@mtsu.edu. And Dr. McGuire, you are free to share that with people if they want. But I'm really grateful for everyone tuning in today, and I'm happy to connect with anyone who would like to.
Wonderful. Thank you again to both of you for taking a few moments to get this message out there, to hopefully pique people's interest in continuing this conversation, in reaching out and getting more support, whether it's education, consulting, accessing some of the resources you mentioned that are available online, to make sure that this isn't just another thing that comes and goes. You know, our awareness is often very passive, and our attention spans as a nation and as a society is often short, and particularly on inclusive and accessible issues. So we encourage everyone who's listening, let this be a launching point for a much deeper dive into how to increase accessibility in Title IX and in all areas of society. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate your time today, and for everyone joining us. If anyone has additional questions, feel free to email me and I can pass them on to any of the speakers, or you can contact them directly as well. This will also be a recording available online for anyone who wants to share it. And again, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Be well.